mortuary had the contract for all military services out at the Roswell Army Airfield. And this gentleman called and said he was a mortuary officer at the base. He needed some information. And I said, what do you need? And he said, how many hermetically sealed infant caskets do you have, 3.5, 4 foot in stock? And I said, we don't have any. How long would it take you to get them? And I said, well, I can call Amarillo by 3:30 this afternoon and have them in here in the morning. I said, what's going on? He said, that's not important. I said, well, it is important also, but anyway. And then I hung up. And then he called back later and he said, I need more information. And you want to know what embalming chemicals that would alter the tissue, the stomach contents, and what is our preparation for taking care of bodies that are laying out in the elements for several days. And I said, you're the mortuary officer and you're asking me because I do it your way, you know. I was trying to find out who I was talking to. But there again, I was very stupid and I hung up again. And so, but anyway, later on in the day, I got an emergency. We had the only ambulance business in Roswell at that time. And this airman was riding an old Indian motorcycle and hit the back end of a farmer's trailer out here going into the gin. And so when I arrived at the base where I usually back up to this ramp and unload the patients, there was 3 field Army Air Force ambulance backed up against the ramp. And so I had to swing around. But anyway, we were walking up the ramp and I saw a lot of debris. And so when I got in and checked him in, got all the vouchers and everything signed, I said, this captain there, and I said, sir, it looked like we had a crash. I need to get ready for it. And who in the hell are you and what are you doing here? And I said, well, I had an emergency and we have the contract for all military services. It looks like you had a crash. He just said, stay right here, don't move. And so I stayed there, and pretty soon he came back with 2 military police and said, get this guy off of the base, he's not supposed to be here. Whenever this happened, whatever had happened, all the doctors and nurses that were stationed here in that area and everything that were stationed here permanently were given orders not to report. Because my understanding and everything later on that came that the reason for that being that these were all specialists and they were all sent in from Wright-Patterson. And so anyway, what he wanted to know from me, I had seen evidently I was involved in things that I shouldn't have been involved in.
When you said you saw some debris, could you go back and...
I saw that, and that's what started it. But what he really wanted to know later on, see, I knew this nurse, and she didn't get orders not to report either because she was going to join the St. Mary's Order, and our hospital was the St. Mary's. And she would come up like on the weekends and not go back until, till her weekend started again, and she'd go in. When she went in to sign in for her next tour of duty, that's when they were in this supply room, and there were 2 pathologists. I understood they were from Wright-Patterson. They were not done an autopsy. They were examining what was brought in from the Roswell crash, what we call the Roswell crash. And the reason that she started out the door, and then they said, Lieutenant, we still have to have some help. And this is what you're going to do. And they wanted her. And so they'd take a forceps and turn a hand. She'd say 4 fragile fingers, so many centimeters, and all this kind of stuff. And she said she wasn't in there over 20 or 30 minutes at the most. And all their eyes, and it started burning in their skin. They were feeling it was getting real warm and real hot. So that's when they just immediately, they had no idea what they had. The 2 pathologists said there wasn't anything in the anatomy books, there wasn't anything in what our medical schools, they had never seen anything like this. And that's immediately after that they were put in these pouches, put in a hermetically sealed container and flown directly to Wright-Patterson.
And she actually described for you what they looked like?
Yeah, when the MPs were taking me out down the hall, that's when she came out of this supply room with this towel over her face, and that's when she screamed, Glenn, get out of here as fast as you can. Then I met her I kept calling, and I met her the next morning at the officers' club in a conference room, and that's when she gave me a little diagram of what they were going on, what they look like. And it looks like what you see today, most of the little diagrams, you know, the 4 fragile fingers and the long arm, real short joint, the large eyes. She said the heads were almost completely demolished, but they could see. They only had 2 orifices. They didn't have earlobes. They had 2 ear canals. The mouth was only about 1 inch. And that's the way she described it to me. And I was with her till about 11:30 that day, and then at 3:30 that afternoon, her supervisor called and said, "Your friend just been transferred out." And I had her serial number and everything else, but I never have found her this day. I've never made contact with her. So I'm sure, I think the best thing they did, she was going to join a convent, and I'd imagine they discharged her and let her go. It's a good place to keep somebody quiet. And he came up to me and he was punching me on the shoulder, just lightly. I mean, he wasn't rough or anything. And he just said, "Look, mister, you don't go in and start any rumors in Roswell. Nothing happened out here." And he said, "If you do, you know, it'd be real serious problems." And so I just, being as my character was at that time, I said, "I'm a civilian, you can go to hell." And that's where he said, "You may be the one going to hell." And then that's when he really told me, he said, "Somebody will be picking your bones out of the sand if you do that." So it didn't look like a plane crash. It didn't look like aluminum or you burn aluminum, because I've seen a lot of that in stainless steel. But what it looked like, of course, it didn't have any in those days. What it looked like more, it was a real light gray, almost to white. And some of it was a real dark gray, but it looked more like what fiberglass might look like today. And it wasn't dent or anything, and there wasn't any dents, but what it was in pieces, looked like it'd been twisted and shredded and all this kind of stuff. But I didn't see any real sharp dents. Of course, I didn't stand there and look at it either, you know. It's just what I noticed on the way going out. But I know it was very thin. I could see that it was very, very thin. I didn't want to embarrass my family for the first place. Next thing, being in the mortuary business is not an easy business. And I didn't want to embarrass the funeral home. I didn't want to embarrass, my father was an old contractor, and I didn't want to embarrass him, because if I'd have come out who was an alien, you know, and all this back in those days, hell, they would have laughed me out of town. My folks knew. I thought it would be very embarrassing. And I didn't want it. Mainly, I idolized my father, and I didn't want to embarrass him, because he and I was very, very close. And I was told, one of those sergeants out there said, "Well, let him go. Hell, nobody's going to believe him anyway. Nobody's going to believe this anyway." So, but that didn't have anything to do with it. It was my family that I wanted to protect, and the funeral business.
He was scared to death, he said.